Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, it's the last episode of The Trailing Edge for 2018. I've got a bunch of albums that I want to knock off and cover, most of which I was planning on covering on vacation, and then vacation kind of took over, so I'm handling them now. So, let's get things started. You know, this is one of those albums that I really wish I liked a lot more than I kind of do. And I say this having gone through Orbital's entire back catalog. That's one reason why this is on the trailing edge. It took so long for me to get to them. Because if you go back to the 90s, this band was a real force to be reckoned with within techno, pulling upon a lot of samples and melody and a real warm, organic presence that I really appreciated. They put out some genuinely great albums across the mid-90s. Yeah, they kind of got sloppy near the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, but they called it quits, they hung it up, and honestly, I was kind of okay with that. They went off on a bang. Then they came back with Wonky a couple years back, and I'll freely admit I did not like that album much at all, specifically because of a lot of the synth tones they chose, because Orbital's always had a pretense towards some of the goofier side that doesn't always do them a lot of flavor, but they came back with Monsters Exist, which I'll say is a little bit better. It's a little bit more mature, it's a little bit more downbeat for once, and they're still bringing that level of organic, sample-driven techno that I like a fair bit, especially with the portents and warning that seems to permeate a lot of this album. Yeah, it can kind of get goofy at spots, and honestly, I really don't like some of the gummier synth choices that they have. That's been a consistent problem that I've had with Orbital for some time, but overall, it still sounds pretty good, and it kind of fits for that forced smile amidst all the greater darkness that's coming, and the warning that, yes, we really have to do something to fix things. But if that was the only problem I'd have, that'd be one thing. The other problem is, they're a little bit harder to quantify. The first thing being that, really, Orbital's not putting out anything close to the best of what they did back in the 90s. And yeah, I kinda have to make the comparison. There just isn't any tracks that stand out as vivid in the same way. They also have a song midway towards the back half of this album, which tries for a more low-key, groove-driven, almost sensual track with some of the samples, and it is extremely jarring. It's not really a sound that Orbital can pull off well in that lane. But as a whole, I don't know what to say about this. Like, any Orbital diehard fans, you're gonna love this because really it fits on a lot of that lane, and I like their brand of production. But it's also an Orbital album that doesn't really pull back away from the foibles that I've had with them for years now, and as such, it doesn't really do a ton for me, especially as it feels as good as some of the central ideas are. Some of Orbital's own personal hang-ups are keeping this album from being as great as it should be. I don't know, for me, it's a strong 6 out of 10. Definitely check it out if you're a fan of this brand of techno, and I am. I can see why some people have loved it as much as they do, but as it is, good, not great. You know, at some point, I'm going to put together a Resonator series exploring post-hardcore, but I'm not sure I'm at that point with this band. This is a debut act from a relatively young Canadian indie post-hardcore act. I even showed this to some other critics who are more post-hardcore fans than I am, and the most response that we came out of it was that it's just pretty much okay. A lot of the clean singing often sounds a lot more convincing than some of the screaming or growls. Hate to say it, but this album doesn't quite handle the juxtaposition between the two all that well. They'd probably be better off being more in the pop punk or even just pure punk rock vein than the post-hardcore thing they got going on, especially when you consider some of the lyrics. Yeah, this is a very angsty listen, and the sort of angst that can run right up to the line of being a little bit presumptuous and honestly not interestingly enough written to really justify itself, as it can get pretty insufferable at some points. Sadly, I gotta say that while a lot of the production is actually pretty atmospheric and pulls upon a lot of tones and textures I like, the bass lines are coursing, the guitar work is legit pretty good, and while I wouldn't say I was crazy fan of a lot of the breakdowns or solos or even some of the atmospheric passages, the transitions are handled well enough. There is technical competency here in terms of a lot of the composition. Sad fact, nobody really talked to them about transitions or any sense of brevity, because this album definitely runs long, and that does not do the vocals or in the lyrics much of a favor. But at the end of the day, I'm just not much of a fan of post-hardcore in this lane. As I said, maybe it's just a matter of familiarity, and I will probably have to do a series more in depth just to get into the genre, but as it is, I see the appeal, but it didn't do much for me. I'm thinking a very light 6 out of 10. Check it out if you're a fan of post-hardcore, but otherwise, you're not missing anything.
Galaxies all around me, they all glitter with a passion. They say, hold on boy, one day you'll be back home.
So Eric Taxxon put out a lot of albums this year, and really, I don't have the time to cover everything he put off on the trailing edge, but I did actually listen to a lot of it on vacation, so I want to talk about some of it. And let's start out with the best thing that he put out all year, Traveler. Now, this is primarily an instrumental synthwave adjacent album. I like to say it pulls on some elements of ambient as well. Really, this is where Eric Taxxon shines and why I like this guy so much to begin with. I love his crescendos of synthesizers. The layered buildup is so damn compelling. A lot of the melodies are so rich, and the textures he chooses here damn near perfect for what he's trying to pull off. I like the spacey backing tones. I like the wistful side. I like the sense of wonderment that comes through this album. It really is a glory to behold, and it's a project that very nearly is great among some of the best things that he's ever done, except for the fact it runs a little bit long and honestly seems like it was just held back a smidge from being great. Part of this actually comes in the lyrics, and that there should be more of them. The one song that he actually does have some lyrics and more of a synthesized auto-tune vocal behind it, I actually think turns out really well. I think it's one of the most compelling cuts on the album here, and I wish there was a little more. And we don't really get that. I kind of think it ends on a bit of a bum note too. Yeah, this was extremely compelling. Definitely recommend you check this out. Extremely strong 7 out of 10. Really good stuff. Wanted to hear more.
I got lots of scrapes. All my niggas shice. You can roll the dice. You might lose your life. Keep my desert eagle on me. He not nothing nice. I just need one Glock. Now I just need one mic.
You know, I'm honestly not too sure what I can even say about this album, specifically as I already covered the majority of it while I was on vacation on Billboard Breakdown. I talked about the best songs there, I talked about the worst songs there, and beyond that, there just isn't a lot to say about 21 Savage. He's not exactly a lyricist in that mold. At the same time, I will say it's better than Issa album, especially on the back half, which sadly the majority of that stuff didn't chart, but it's honestly where I think 21 Savage hits his greatest stride. At the points where I actually kind of like this guy, and when it takes his low-key, kind of ruthlessly subtle brand of gangster rap and actually can cultivate a sense of danger, or even when he gets a little bit more intimate on the song Toward His Mama. When he sticks more towards a little bit more introspection in that brand of gangster rap, I actually kind of can get behind this album. Sadly, that's not the majority of this album. And yeah, while he will bring a little bit more detail to some of his gangster rap flexing, the sad fact is that when he's engaged more in the luxury rap or any songs about girls, that penchant for detail can wind up being a penchant for corniness, and it honestly kind of rubs me the wrong way how often he has some real clunkers of lines, especially as against his particular brand of delivery. They don't work at all. Also, keep the auto-tune away from this guy because that doesn't work at all either. Then you get to the guest stars, kind of a mixed bag. I didn't mind when Childish Gambino showed up, although he's certainly done better. Schoolboy Q's on this. That was pretty cool. I actually think Post Malone's collaboration with 21 Savage actually turns out really well, as the thicker, more heavy guitar-driven atmosphere is a great fit for that song. But otherwise, I don't know what to say about this. It's better than Issa album, but it's not really something I'm going to come back to as often, and I wouldn't say 21 Savage is quite yet compelling enough as a lyricist or personality to really consistently grip me for an entire project. I'll say when he gets away from more of the commercial songs on this album, especially towards the final third, the album actually takes a sharp increase in quality, so stick for the stuff in the back half, skip the rest. I'm thinking light 6 out of 10. Check it if you're curious.
You got your wishes. Now you think you're the shoe. It's just that it's not changing no more.
I honestly wish I could say more about this band beyond Well, it's prog metal. It's not particularly good prog metal, but if you're a fan of prog metal, you might like this. See, here's the thing with Vennart. They were formed of the remnants of a band that was pretty decent in the mid-2000s. This is their sophomore album, and I gotta be honest, I haven't really liked anything that's come from both the previous band or this one, and this album did not change anything in that regard. Yes, the bass lines sound good, the rhythm section is actually pretty decent overall, and you know what, some of the guitar passages are pretty compelling. There are some decent melodies here. Sadly, they couldn't say the same thing for a lot of the synth production and texture, but really production is an issue for this project as a whole. It feels really flat in the mid-range. A lot of the guitars can come across as pretty thin, and sadly, this album does not quite get as heavy as it really should to back it all up. There's a couple songs at the end that kind of get close, but really by that point I had lost patience. And a big part of this comes with the frontman here. I'm honestly not quite sure what the hell he's trying to do. He reminds me of a mid-90s grunge singer, except without a lot of the edge, and yet placed a little bit too far back in the mix to deliver his vocals convincingly. But he's got this swaggering bro side of his edge that's honestly more reminiscent of post-grunge and the commercial attempts there. A lot of the lyricism just isn't really good enough to justify that kind of delivery. I don't know, folks, like, I found this album a real chore to sit through, especially given how long it runs, how bad some of the synth choices are, and really, given the lyrics don't do anything all that exceptional, it just becomes a lot of prog metal without a lot of decent hooks to back it up. Wasn't a fan. Thinking a 5 out of 10. Check it out if you're curious, but you wouldn't be missing much. So it's funny, among Eric Taxxon fans, I've seen some rather mixed responses to this album, that it was the sort of ambiance that really kind of broke the camel's back when it came to him, and that Telecommunications, for as good as it might sound, it's also a little bit fragmented, doesn't quite stick the landing with its blend of blurry, fuzzed out samples as well as it could. Yeah, I kind of disagree with this, because I like this album a fair bit. I wouldn't say it's among my favorite ambient pieces that he's ever put out. I think Cicada is probably still the top-notch in that regard, but yeah, I like this album. I like the choice of samples that it does in terms of producing almost a skyward focus, almost a quasi-spiritual flirtation with this album that I think is really quite compelling. Yeah, it does run long at spots, and again, I'm not quite sure it ends on the best of ways, but there's parts of this album I really like. I like the textural vibes, I like the crescendos, I think the transitions are really well handled, and for this brand of ambience, yeah, it clicks. I'm thinking a 7 out of 10. It's not going to be for everyone, but it worked for me. Certainly better than Majesty did. God, that album was bad.
There's a danger in the
So this was another project I was actually hoping to like a fair bit more than I do with this, because hey, it's retro synthwave, calling back to the early to mid 80s, kind of got a little bit of a gothic vibe to it. I can certainly groove with that, and the band's pedigree was pretty strong, coming off of a self-titled album a few years back that I thought was pretty decent. Not really great, but decent enough. It certainly fit that retro vibe. And yet this album was a bit of a letdown, I gotta be honest. I still think it's pretty good. If you're a fan of this brand of synthwave, it will grow on you. The synthesizer textures are really good. I like the embellishments of saxophone that come in occasionally. Some of the guitar and bass lines are good, even if the bass lines can feel a bit clunky at spots, especially near the percussion. And yeah, the album does run long again, but at the same time, the hooks can be good. It did grow on me more than I was expecting, and while I find the male vocals to be really kind of underwhelming, they kind of fit with the mood and atmosphere of this sort of album. And if you can sink into that atmosphere, it certainly will fit the bill. But beyond that, lyrically, it's really undercooked. I keep finding myself trying to like this more, but when the lyrics are as thin and flat as they otherwise be, defaulting to a lot of cliches in this particular subgenre, it just doesn't give you a lot to say beyond that. I mean, I enjoyed it. It's certainly easy for me to put on, but it's not all that memorable either, so I'm thinking a solid 6 out of 10. Check it out if you're curious, but it's not better than their debut, so take of that what you will.
This is isolation, kept in the dark and waiting. You're wearing the crown of kingdoms of
You know, I almost feel a little bit at a loss for words with this one. I mean, it's Beartooth. I wasn't really a fan of this band to begin with. I always thought they were pretty one-dimensional, especially when it came to the writing. And while that can be kind of redeemed by enough soaring presence or firepower, especially in the vocals or the guitar line, I've never thought their production was all that good or striking or truly heavy to really drive that home. Now, this was more of an issue that came on Aggressive, their second album, which felt really generic to me. I'll say this, Disease does not feel generic. It's still not well produced though, my god. They could try to bring in more pop punk elements here with a little bit brighter choruses and more clean sung vocals. And I'll admit it can kind of work with some of the content, but at the same time, this is not a band that's evolved much over the course of 3 albums. Yeah, the melodies are a little shinier, but it doesn't make the production feel any less stiff and thin, especially in the low end. It doesn't hit with a lot of force. And yeah, the writing is still painfully generic, especially in calling to mind this sort of level of instability that really has felt out of kind of overplayed on Aggressive and just feels tired now. I'm not saying it's bad or anything, but at the same time, if you're a Beartooth fan, it is more of the same, it is catchier, but I'm not sure the pivot towards more pop textures is what Beartooth fans want. For me, yeah, it makes it a little bit better than Aggressive, but not saying much. 5 out of 10. You know what? It's not supposed to end like this, and it really sucks that it kind of does, because I was kind of rooting for Vinyl Theater. I wouldn't say I was a huge fan at all. I thought the writing was kind of generic, and honestly the hooks weren't grabbing me much either, and the blend of more synthetic pop production with more of the pop punk side, it wasn't anything extraordinary. I honestly thought Waterparks was doing it better, but I had hopes that when they got signed by Fuel by Ramen, they'd have a little bit more texture, they'd be able to pulse things together, maybe make things a little bit tighter, really amp up the hooks. And then they got dropped by Fuel by Ramen and said they were going in a different direction, and I had the hopes that it would sound really good. Okay, they're taking that sort of level of artistic control, and at the end of the day, it all just feels like it's surrounding a pretty subpar album. I hate saying that, folks, I really do, but the production feels like it's a low-rent 21 Pilots from about 3 years ago. There's not nearly the sense of atmosphere. The synths feel really thin. The bass lines and grooves are pretty much non-existent, and the lyrics just don't do much for me at all. I really wanted to come up here and say this was passable, but I'm struggling with it. At the end of the day, with this sort of pop punk or pop-leaning pop punk, you kind of need a little bit more texture or hooks or something going on to pull me back in, but sadly, it's just not really here. I'm gonna be that guy to say it, but this is an extremely light 5 out of 10, and I feel like I'm being real generous. I mean, points to you guys for pulling it out, but I'm not coming back to it.
You let go instead when there's time to be scared.
So this is a bit of a weird album for me to talk about because it was been on my schedule for some time and I want to take the time to personally cover it. And in all due honesty, I'm kind of glad I did because you're not going to hear much else like it. For one thing, it actually balances out between a number of different genres quite well. Brings in R&B, hints of more ambient electronica, but the 2 genres it covers the most are more of a smooth jazz vibe and also more of a low-key, restrained indie pop vibe. I think like an artist like Rye, or maybe going back to like the early to mid 2000s. Not quite as distorted, but very sensual, very understated. And I kind of grooved with it a fair bit. The female vocals sound great and bring a lot of soul to the proceedings. The bass lines and the percussion, they've got a very low-key restraint, but also providing enough coursing foundation to make this work. I think a lot of the melodies are often really pretty, even if some of the instrumental embellishments can feel a tad on the weird side. There's some incorporation of accordion and horns that I'm not quite certain works as well as they think it does, but again, it's distinctive, it's unique, and for the most part, I like a lot of the writing too. I wouldn't say it's great writing in this mold of indie rock or more on the indie pop, indie R&B vibe, but it fits the mold. It's got a certain wistful melancholy I can appreciate. But what I think holds this album back in greatness is just some elements of polish and structure. On the one hand, as much as they try for some hip-hop elements, including some rap verses, the album doesn't quite have the groove or texture to really make those stand out or stick the landing. I honestly don't think the rapping's all that good either. And for another, this album can run a little long. It can feel a little bit indulgent in spots, especially near the back half, especially with some of the transitions they try. I'm not saying they aren't ambitious, for sure, and for the most part, the transitions are actually pretty interesting. This album rarely gets boring, and with a project as low-key as this, that is definitely a point in their favor. But beyond that, it just doesn't quite grab me as much as I want either. The hooks aren't quite as vibrant. A lot of the actual production is so low-key. You're kind of looking for those elements of texture or solid writing to really put it over the top. I'm not sure they're there. But again, I think it's worthwhile checking out. It's pretty enjoyable, especially if you're into that sort of very low-key vibe. Throw it on the right cocktail party, you'll probably get people into it. So, light 7 out of 10. Check it out. I'm just not sure what to say with this one, because honestly, a lot of the same comments I made about Clean Bandit a couple weeks back, I could also say about Sigala here. It basically has the feeling of a project that's been cobbled together over a couple of different years, and the production style has been evolving or changing as well, specifically in this case between 2015 and mid-2017. And you know what, that's not exactly a bad thing if the hooks are there, or the guest appearances are there, or just the melodies are there in general. And that's kind of where I struggle with this album. At least Clean Bandit, at their best, they have that focus on more of a crisp, refined melody, whereas Sigala is just as all over the place, maybe even a little bit more cohesive, coming in some of the more focus on the tropical vibes. But at the same time, I wouldn't quite say the melodies are as strong or as striking or as vibrant. I'd say a lot of the vocal performances from the guest stars, they can really feel all over the place. Why is Flow Rider even here? Like, I think his time's pretty much over, even though I didn't mind what he was doing. He's at least distinctive. But at the same time, you heard a lot of this sort of tropical house sound before, and I'm not sure Sigala's doing enough to really elevate it or put it on a different level, or even add this electronica the sort of swell or potency it could really use or deserve. So yeah, it's fine, it's pleasant, but while I was listening to this on vacation, I came to the sharp realization that I could take my headphones out and listen to a lot of the same backing music that was being played at the resort, and I wouldn't notice much of a difference. Bit of a problem there. Still pleasant enough though, so extremely light 6 out of 10. Now, this was a project I was actually planning on reviewing until I just ran out of time at the end of the year and kind of don't have a lot to say about it. I mean, it's Tim Hecker. I've struggled with his work a little bit in the past, even though I think a lot of people kind of misinterpreted my original review, especially considering I do like a fair bit of this guy's work. Virgins was a great album. Rave Death 1972 was even better. I can get into his brand of ambience if there's a bit more going on, or there's a bit more foundation, or there's crescendos or transitions I can really gravitate towards. And I'll say this, Konoyo is probably one of his most immediate albums to date, bringing a lot of Japanese plucked instrumentation in terms of backing arranged elements that actually bring a lot of presence to his thicker wells of ambient electronics. There are more transitions, there are more defined melodies, there's more going on here, and I gotta respect that. At the same time, I wouldn't quite say it's among his best. Part of this is my own tonal preferences, as some of the Japanese plucked elements can not feel stale, but not always be tones that I gravitate to the most. At the same time, I appreciate the elegance of all of it, but they can start to feel like they run a little bit thin, and the fusion of his sound with those elements can feel a little precarious at points, almost as if this album is trying to stitch together disparate elements that don't quite match as well as they should. That said, I did think this is a return to form coming off of Love Streams, which I still only think is okay, and I think this is a pretty good album. If you're into Tim Hecker's brand of ambience, you probably already heard this, but in the meantime, light 7 out of 10. Check this out. Good stuff.
For For a song can always come in many shapes and many colors. Maybe I've made a good case for mine.
You know what? I've been sitting here for the past 20 minutes trying to record some sort of response to this, trying to discuss the second half of Eric Taxon's year. And really, I wish I had more good things to say about it. I do. Because the first half of this year, there were great projects that felt refined. It felt like there was more going on that I could like and respect. The second half of this year, not so much. First, you had projects like Majesty, which just felt incredibly undercooked, and I'll say it, lazy. Taking a lot of chopped up samples, speeding them up, jamming them together, and raising them to blaring frequencies that I rarely could even come close to liking. It's a bad project. Then there's Two Tone, which again, I appreciate the ambition to go for more of a pop sound that's more blown up, more reminiscent of mainstream EDM, only for a lot of his fan base to snap awake and come to the sharp realization of his limitations, as most of the songs did not have much going for them. And then in an attempt to win back all his fans from Paul, we have Lil Spoon. And you know what? I wish I liked this. You know what? I do like it somewhat. There are ideas that work here, but like the rest of his material in the second half of this year, they feel like ideas that are not fully realized. And again, it's the same sort of thing I've been struggling with Eric Taxon for so long now. He puts out so much work that if you just spend a little bit more time to refine a project and actually focus in on good ideas and realize his limitations, he could probably make some great music. I know he can make great music. But this album, whenever it feels like he comes close to a great idea, he pulls away, or he does something that just makes me frustrated with him to no end. Because, yeah, there are good songs here, but not a lot of great ones. And what frustrates me so much is that there are ideas from Eric Taxon's older albums that are here and could potentially still work. I like the synthesizers. I like the keyboards. I like his embrace of more organic elements in order to cultivate that sense of intimacy. I like that there's a guitar brought in. But at the same time, I listened to his vocals, and here's the thing that made Paul work so damn well. It was restrained, it was quiet, it felt intimate. It didn't feel like it was overselling itself. It understood its lane and understood his limitations as a singer, because he's not a good singer. I'll make that very plain and straightforward, but that lack of vocal control, that more flat nasal non-singer skill, that fit for what Paul was. It enhanced its organic intimacy. It made it feel more real in that lane. Whereas with Lil Spoon, you can tell it doesn't feel as real. You can tell there are more elements of artifice. You can tell he's singing more with less cushions of reverb and auto-tune around him on this project, and it only highlights his limitations that much more sharply. He's selling it with a level of degree, a level of confidence that doesn't back up his ability. And sadly, I say a lot of the same thing about the writing too. The writing just doesn't feel as intimate. Whenever it seems like it's gonna get to a more love-struck and sincere point, he jerks it away. And that's what hurts this album. It feels like a lot of the same organic elegance and intimacy that came on a project like Paul. It feels like they're trying to manufacture some of that honesty here, and it doesn't feel as honest. It doesn't click in the same degree. Yeah, a lot of the tones are there to almost approximate the feeling, but it doesn't quite get there. There are moments I like, don't get me wrong. I still think he's got a ton of talent, but if there's a point where he needs to step back, really refine a project like this, and really to actually manage to nail down on what he really can do well and his limitations, this is the project that really cements it in my mind that he's got the potential to get there, but he needs the refinement and focus, because that's what hurts this project the most. So yeah, 6 out of 10. Check it out if you're curious, but he's made a lot better, especially the first half of this year.